The American postcard, a time-honored tradition nearly as old as the Postal Service itself. A novelty born in an age of handwritten letters, a charming form of shorthand that could travel the country in a matter of weeks for the princely sum of 1 cent.
I hope Evelyn will soon be better. I am making the girls light blue silk
Dear
dresses
wife,
for
I
Christmas
won't
night.
cover you till Saturday morning. Your nurse
I
says you won't
received your
be able to
postal a
stand
few
the
days
trip.
ago. Thanks for it. We have 1 week left of school now. When is your school going to start?
The early 1900s were a time of grit, determination, and self-reliance. A man worked hard, or he didn't eat. The same was true of the women. And in these rugged years of a frontier newly tamed, with its automobiles and motor-powered aircraft, emerged another delightful marvel, one that would at first enchant the public, the so-called exaggeration postcard. Little did anyone suspect that these simple, humorous cards would catalog one of the most dire periods of American history. World's Fair, Paris, 1900. More than 50 million visitors passed through the Parisian gates to witness the remarkable achievements, monuments to man's resourcefulness. Rudolf Diesel's new engine, the first working escalator, and the world's largest telescope whose optical assembly was nearly 200 feet long. But there was one seemingly insignificant exhibit, one not nearly as interesting to the spectacle-loving public. Inside a cabinet of assorted minerals was a single stone, nearly lost among the others. Posted below the glowing piece was a simple sign, Radium Pitch Blende, Madame Marie Curie. Few realized it at the time, but this small display would have a larger impact on their lives than anything else witnessed in the Parisian exhibits. Long before Robert Oppenheimer's Manhattan Project or the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in one unassuming corner of the world's grandest show, the atomic age had quietly begun. Over the next few years, Marie and Pierre Curie performed countless experiments in this fledgling science of radioactivity. Thousands of hours of intense study were devoted to the mysterious effects of these heavy elements. The Curies were soon convinced of the therapeutic potential of radioactivity. In cooperation with local hospitals, they administered radium treatments to patients throughout France. The treatments would prove unsuccessful and oftentimes deadly, but the hope for future cures remained high. News of the Curie's achievements would spread throughout Europe and across the sea. An American capitalist by the name of Herman Beck was fascinated by the work of the Curies and corresponded with them frequently. Many of his letters still survive in the Curie collection of France's National Library, locked away in the lead-lined boxes that house the still radioactive notes of the famous scientist.
Of particular interest to me is your work with plant roots and their attraction to radioactive sources. These, the simplest of God's creations, are drawn to a power we can scarcely comprehend. What do they sense, I wonder? More practical studies must be performed, and with your blessing, I would like to be the one to perform these studies.
If the Curies ever replied to Beck on this subject, the communication is lost to history. But Herman Beck, a self-styled scientist from a hardy line of farmers and ranchers, needed no prompting from others, not even his much-adored idols. He purchased old equipment from a mining company that had fallen on hard times. Within months, his operation was hauling pounds of radium from the ground, then tons. His miracle growing soil, a rich mixture of irradiated peat and manure, was not an instant success, though. At first, only the smallest, most desperate farmers were willing to give it a try. Beck shipped out free samples by the ton. It was a costly gamble, one that nearly buried the fledgling company. Beck even traveled the country on his own, extolling the virtues of his miracle soil to anyone who would listen. The results were overwhelming. Crop yields were astounding, far beyond the expectations of even the die-hard salesman. Beck was once heard to say, in a moment of dangerous candor, that the Lord God himself would be hard-pressed to perform such miracles. Luckily for him, most farmers agreed. Word spread quickly, and others began clamoring for Beck's miracle-growing soil. Demand was quickly outstripping supply. He ramped up production immediately, shipping soil to hundreds, then thousands of farmers all across the heartland of the United States. At one point, Beck's soil accounted for 15% of rail freight in the country. Within 3 years, there wasn't a farmer in the Midwest who hadn't heard of it. A few bumper crops hit the market, and buyers snapped them up. The news spread quickly. It seemed too good to be true. Herman Beck, ever the clever promoter, released a series of postcards to help advertise his business. Most were poorly produced, but they sold by the thousands. The business continued to boom. The miracle growing soil couldn't be produced quickly enough. Beck launched an even larger mining operation to feed the need for new radioactive materials. Nearly every miner in a 5-state area worked for Beck. But the illness rates at the mines were high, even for an admittedly dangerous occupation. Radioactivity was never thought to be the cause, however. In fact, many of the men were treated with irradiated tonics to cure their mysterious ills. Herman Beck's name and reputation spread across the country. The literal fruits of his labor made him famous among those who tilled the soil. But it was his postcards that introduced him to the city dwellers of the East. For a time, the sales of his postcards nearly surpassed those of his fertilizer. One enterprising man recognized an opportunity in this growing market, but he wasn't a farmer, he was a photographer. William Martin had already produced hundreds of postcards through his marginally successful business, the W.H. Martin Postcard Company. He primarily produced landscapes and other mundane subjects that were wholly unremarkable. Though Beck's cards sold by the tens of thousands, he was no photographer. William Martin would incorporate some artistry and often humor into his cards. He even paid some farmers to double and triple dose their crops to create truly gargantuan subjects for his cards. Farmers delivered their oversized crops to market by any means necessary. Wagons, cars, trucks, and trains. All it had to have was a set of wheels. And Martin was there to catalog it all. Not until it was too late did Martin realize the cataclysmic events he had set in motion for the sake of his humorous so-called exaggeration postcards.
Mr. Martin's tampering with the food chain led to some inevitable consequences. It is obvious to us now, but the promise of fame and wealth, for the farmers as well as Martin himself, blinded all to what would inevitably transpire.
Like the giant crops that preceded them, the large insects were a novelty at first. The affluent city dwellers purchased these creatures as house pets. The country folk had better sense than to make pets of these things, but that didn't stop them from selling to their rich city cousins. The insects quickly became known as the rich man's folly. The peddlers traveled from one city to the next in custom delivery trucks, selling the oversized insects door to door to wealthy housewives.
Insects have a natural limit to their size. They don't have lungs as such, and their growth is limited by the amount of available oxygen. During prehistoric times, the oxygen content of the atmosphere was nearly double, and the insects grew far larger. The mutated insects of the Beck era, however, were able to grow to greater size due to the development of what is known as a proto-lung, which allowed them to breathe like mammals. After that, there was no theoretical limit as to how large they could grow.
But there were those who weren't concerned about the science. They saw this as a different sort of problem. Reverend Ezekiel Montgomery, a revivalist, hell and brimstone preacher and self-professed prophet of God, saw these man-made creations as the devil's work, sign of the end times. He shouted his pronouncements to all who would listen. His message found a willing audience of religious zealots. His traveling ministry wound its way through the Midwest, a caravan of true believers who lived off the land and the word of their leader. An anti-scientific fervor spread amongst those most susceptible to Montgomery's teachings. A fire broke out in one of Beck's fertilizer plants in Nebraska. The building was destroyed, along with its contents. Montgomery's followers were accused of starting the blaze. Dark clouds of radioactive smoke moved quickly across the state. Even farmers who had never used Beck's now legendary soil began to see the startling growth in their own fields. These freeloaders, as Beck called them, were reaping the benefits of his misfortune. Their crops were now every bit as large as those of Beck's paying customers. Walter Martin hired more photographers, some from as far away as New York City. His voracious public demanded more, and Martin and his men delivered. Mail routes in the larger cities had to bring on extra carriers to handle the increased volume of Martin's postcards. But to the city dwellers, the cards were pure fantasy. This was all just a wonderful, clever hoax. Reality was about to set in, however. The spring runoff poured heavy radioactive materials into the lakes and streams. And like evolution in reverse, mutation spread from land to water. Some towns reveled in the sudden appearance of large fish, each touting their own particular lake as a fisherman's paradise. There was stiff competition between the towns, with each attempting to outdo its neighbors with more and more fantastical tales, backed up with photographic evidence, of course. But the sudden spike in lake traffic, coupled with the increasingly larger and more aggressive fish, began to call into question who exactly was at the top of the food chain. But it wasn't just a fascinated public drawn to the images. The government had quietly taken note of the radioactive phenomenon as well. Not content to let nature have its way, powerful men in league with the government, even President Roosevelt himself, sought to harness this power for their own nefarious purposes. Names like Carnegie and Morgan, Gould, and Rockefeller. President Theodore Roosevelt formed the National Radiological Commission. The organization was based in an anonymous-looking building in Fairfax, Virginia. The commission's initial budget was estimated to be larger than the Department of War. But Martin, along with most Americans, was unaware of what the government had planned. He just continued about his business, purchasing an abandoned motor vehicle plant, setting up his new headquarters. Output was pushed to near capacity in a matter of months. He had plenty of material to keep his presses turning. His fleet of delivery wagons could barely keep up with the demand, and the demand continued to grow, along with the animals. The livestock were the first to experience the growth. Many would eat 3 times their weight in feed per day to fuel their racing metabolisms. The cost of feed was more than the value of the livestock in most cases. Auctions brought a fair price for the more sought-after breeds, but even those profits weren't as great as they seemed. But the hunting, well, that was pretty good. The overabundance of giant wildlife made even the most average of hunters seem like sharpshooters, perfect postcard material. Of course, some of the creatures weren't quite as keen to give up without a fight. And a few enterprising cowboys in Kansas hosted what was known as the Rodent Rodeo.
The grasshoppers were the first genuine threat to man. Sure, there were a few mutated mammals that appeared seemingly out of nowhere, as well as some oversized lake creatures, but these were easily controlled. A few zealous hunters and fishermen were able to clean up that environmental disaster in short order. It was seen as sport to these men, a challenge. But the grasshoppers, no one was prepared for that. Not the hunters, and certainly not the government. To actually see one of these monsters for the first time, I can't imagine. It had to be quite a shock.
They grew to fantastic sizes, 10, 15 tons of crop-destroying fury, derailing trains and ruining farm equipment all across the plains. Despite Martin's glib treatment of the subject, these beasts were no laughing matter. Much of the destruction was blamed on hail, tornadoes, or other acts of God. Typically, there weren't any survivors around willing to dispute the government accounts. Martin's postcards stopped being so humorous. Those in the cities began to believe. There was simply too much evidence to be ignored. The postcards were suddenly looked upon as a sort of unofficial news source, often contradicting the tales put forth by the newspapers. Martin lost several of his photographers to some of these so-called natural disasters. Many left his employ, and those who remained demanded hazard pay. The company went so far as to purchase a fleet of armored vehicles for its most daring photographers, as well as other innovative experiments. Under tremendous public pressure, the government closed down Beck's fertilizer factory in 1910. 6 months later, Beck took his own life. Nebraska Governor Schallenberger called in the state militia to help combat the growing menace. It was the largest military action in the state's history, 10,000 men strong. And the W.H. Martin Company was there to cover it all. Martin's photographers put themselves in the thick of the action, caring little for their own safety. President Roosevelt sent in another 30,000 federal troops to bolster the state volunteers. The old soldier even traveled with his men for several weeks to help bolster morale. The battle raged for months, a land assault that had seen no equal up to then. The Army beat back the irradiated creatures, but the U.S. soldiers paid a heavy toll, 5,000 casualties, and countless numbers maimed and crippled. The president ordered the presses of W.H. Martin seized and destroyed under the Sedition Act. Americans had seen enough. And that would seem to be the end of the story. William Martin died in his home in 1940. Discredited, reviled, a broken man. Farmers returned to their lands and farmed it the way their fathers had. Under President Truman, the Radiological Commission was absorbed by the United States Atomic Energy Agency in 1946. But an interesting thing was discovered inside a hidden compartment of Martin's personal desk, found quite by accident, as some of his belongings were being prepared for auction. A plain manila envelope containing a single striking photograph. Evidence of a larger secret project that would extend well into the 1950s and beyond.